So, welcome to our session, Making More of Open Source. I'm Greg Albers. I'm joined on the panel here with Megan Forbes from Collection Space and Lyrasis, and Ellen Martin from Nafundi. And we're all going to be talking about open source software today. I'm going to start with just a bit of an intro, and I'll do some specific stuff, and then we'll kind of pass the mic down. We're going to try to leave a lot of time for questions and discussion afterwards as well. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this session really is a kind of a follow-up to a session that I did last year on a project that I did called Mapping Open Source in Museums, where I looked at museums on GitHub, who was there, what kind of activity I could kind of data mine from that, and if I could see any kind of any evidence of sharing of open source software, like what did the sector look like, what did the environment look like, the ecosystem of open source software museums, and were we sharing, were we reusing this material, or what were we doing? I did some updates to that data for now, so that website that was just up, the website is geealbers.github.io/mapping-open-source. So that website, I've updated it with new data from this year now. And just a couple bits about that I wanted to point out. So these two graphs show museums joining GitHub. So last year when I was looking at this, if you look at the graph on the, don't know my left and my right, my left, you can see that back there we had very few museums joining in 2018. There's kind of a big drop there. The updated data, similar, like the sort of shape of the graph has changed, mostly because I found more museums, some of which had joined GitHub earlier, and so we kind of added old data. But the basic shape of the curve there is not changing. There's a very big spike in 2015 for museums joining, and then it's really been a down sort of slope from there. And I could posit that's maybe we've saturated the market, or that GitHub has gotten as many museums largely as it can. Now that should be taken with a grain of salt, because the museums that I've mapped on GitHub are only ones that I've happened to have been able to find. So that's knowing people that are there, having lists. It's compiled from a number of lists that other people have put together over the years, and then just going around and searching museum on GitHub and seeing if you could find users. So there certainly could be more there that we're missing, but I think that it's fair to say that there's certainly saturation. In terms of the repositories of the projects that were being created in GitHub, last year, again, we saw this sort of drop in 2018, as sort of a steady rise in projects in GitHub, and then in 2018 there was a little drop. But now looking at that data in 2019, actually 2018 went back up again. So that far side of the graph, the far right under the 2019 version, that's 2019 projects starting. So those are lower again, but I think we'll see, if I was going to do this a year from now, I think we'd see it come up. So I think a lot of museums are on GitHub. They're adding an increasing number of projects there and these are all public projects. These are things that museums have put up and left open for others to go and use or look at in various ways. And there's certainly more museums and more projects that are being kept private that museums are just using as they're developing work. All in all, right now in 2019, we have identified 158 museums on GitHub, 1,845 public repositories, which is a huge number of projects, I think. There's a list of them on that website that I did, where you can just kind of start scrolling all of those projects in the descriptions, and you scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll. And it's a lot. It's a ton of things. And also, all of that, the 1,845 repositories in there are over 3,000 contributors. Certainly more contributors than there are working in museum technology. I think a lot of that is, museums are bringing in open source projects. They're reusing things from outside the sector, and the contributor count is going up as a result. I talked about the kinds of things that are in there, and of those 1,845, there's a lot. So I just grabbed some names from the list. There's a helper class for drawing an animated sine wave into a canvas element. Might be helpful for you, I don't know. Cover for closing a Logidule, which I don't know what a Logidule is. Someone might. Our internal front-end boilerplate, a tool to download and store data and images, Drupal module for generic Taverna workflows in Fedora. A lot of names there. Kiosk app wrapper for museum media exhibits, file storage for email signature images, an app to back up photos from Flickr, an app for collecting gallery rating data. So there's actually, I think some of those I put in because they're funny and made me laugh, and I like words. But some of them actually sound like I could see that other museums might have use for some of that information, but I don't think we're not necessarily seeing that reuse now. And I think that not being able to see reuse and all of these repositories, all these projects that are being posted to GitHub, I kind of think that that's a case of we're using GitHub as sort of passive open source. So it's the idea that we're putting up there, we're leaving these repositories open. Sometimes we're putting a license on them, sometimes not. But we're not really doing anything to help develop or help grow that software or help other institutions find and use that software sort of more explicitly. It's more like if they happen to find it, or if I want to talk to, maybe if I share it directly with someone, then they'll use it. So that's what brings us here today. It's really the question of how do we make more? How do we take this sort of passive, this huge repository of what could be actually useful code contributions that other museums might be able to use? How do we take that to the next level if we want to, and make some of this useful, make it discoverable, have other institutions and others outside the sector adopt it more? And so that's today's topic. So I'm going to start out by talking about some GitHub, sort of following up on my work looking at GitHub museums on GitHub. I'm going to talk about some GitHub community tools. Then Ellen is going to talk about Mozilla's Open Leadership Program. And then Megan's going to finish us up with the It Takes a Village guidebook that she worked on through Lyrasis. So we'll go from there. All right, and I'm going to put on a timer for myself at this point so I don't just ramble too long, because I do want to make sure we have room for questions at the end. So in terms of what I do, I'm the digital publications manager at the Getty. So I work in the print publishing department. We have a robust print publishing program, and I started at the Getty 6 years ago to kind of figure out what it meant to make that digital. One of sort of our core projects is a thing called Quire, which is an open, it's a multi-format publishing software that we're building to use, and we've been using it internally for many years now to publish online books, but also those books come out in PDF and ebook. It's really, we are looking for a website tool or web and publishing tool that would bring sort of some discoverability and some longevity to these digital publications projects that we're building. So we've been using it for a while. We always intended to, or we always wanted to make this open source, but we were kind of thinking originally like kind of more of a passive open source. Like we'll use it, if it works, great, we'll put it out, and maybe someone else will want to use it. But now we're taking that a step further and wanting to really do something more explicit. And so we're working with our internal digital team, and we're in the process now of hiring for a 2-year period a full-time developer and a full-time community manager to help take Quire and kind of make it into a fully fledged open source project. So far we have about 100 people in our beta using it. Various institutions are testing it, and some have actually published some works with the beta version of Quire, which is great. But again, we're looking for ways of continuing that growth. So that's kind of what I'm doing here today, what brought me into sort of these questions about open source and museums. So GitHub tools. So GitHub is a place where a lot of people share and work and share code and share projects. GitHub has some built-in sort of tools that we can use to help community use and adopt those products. In any repository, any project on GitHub, if you go to github.com/the user's name and then / the name of the repository of the project and then /community, there's this little community sort of profile board or a profile that's looking for a variety of things. And I'm sorry this is small on both of these screens. But it's looking for certain documents inside that project that will help contributors use that software, understand and use that software. So you can check out this if you're hosting GitHub projects yourself, or if you're looking at GitHub projects that you might want to adopt, you can go to the community profile and kind of see where they stand, and I'm going to go into more detail. That community profile is looking for certain files inside your project, and these are what they are. The first one is called README, and the .md, if you're not familiar with it, is just Markdown. It's a plain text file format, and so this is this sort of all capitals naming, and then the .md is this sort of convention that GitHub uses to store information inside a project like this. So README file is supposed to answer a few questions. What does this for someone else, not for yourself? Well, maybe for yourself too, if you've written software and then forgotten what it does. You want to go look at your own README. which is the thing that happens. It should say, what does this do? What problem is being solved? How does it work? So this is the sort of introduction to the software that someone's looking at. Then there's a license.md file. So that would contain what license is this being released under. And so open source, you can put something on GitHub. If it doesn't have a license, technically it's not yours to use. It's open, it's there for you to look at, but without an explicit license, you shouldn't necessarily take it into something you use in production in an institutional sense, certainly. So a license file will more explicitly tell an institution or someone else looking, what exactly can I do with this software? Are there limitations? Do I need to give anyone credit, or how do I handle that? Support.md. This is actually a newer file that's just starting, a newer kind of thing that GitHub is looking at. It's basically answers the question of what if I need help? Like what do I do if I need help as a user? So the support.md file is a way of pointing users to discussion forums or helplines or wherever they need to go to find help to use that software. Next is contributing.md, which answers the question, how can I help? So if I want to contribute to this project, if I want to adopt it but also want to fix it or add more to it, how do I go about doing that? What are the standards that I should follow? And then the code of conduct. And that's, so if I'm part of this community, if there's many contributors, many users using this, how are conflicts resolved? How are we working together? Over on the far side there's a little pop-up box. With these files in place in your GitHub repository, GitHub itself will actually look at those files and add little sort of helpful tips for users as they're logged into the site. They'll say, oh, if you're looking to use a software and there's this, be sure to check out the readme.file or whatever, and they can point you to it. So GitHub is looking for these files as a way of augmenting how it supports the community around your project. So those things basically split up into two categories. One is if you want people to use your code, those first 3 documents are really helpful. And if you want people to help write it, those second documents are helpful. In museums in general, looking at those repositories that we identified, 75% of them already have a README, 43% of them have a license.md, very, very few do anything beyond that, like very, very few. And actually the ones that are there, the 2 and 3% on contributing and code of conduct, I went in and kind of looked at a bunch of them to see what they were, and a lot of them are sort of boilerplate things that they're kind of copied over from another thing, or you could tell that they're not necessarily really engaging like a contributor would be. So that's kind of where we're stand in museums. I mentioned this table on the project that we put together on the mapping open source and museums. So there's there's the table of all of the repositories that were identified. This is a great place to go, and I would love to feedback on it from anyone. If you go and look at this, if you'd like to see more information there, if you think something else would be useful, I feel like if we had a place where we could collectively share some projects that we're doing and some place we could go to see what other museums are doing in this, or have done rather, in the code, it would be great. So that's the sort of nascent version of that, little plug. Okay, GitHub user issues. So GitHub also has issue tracking. So one thing we can do to help people, bring people along into contributing to open source software is to really think about how we share and how we post issues about that software when there are bugs to do or bugs to be fixed or features that need to be built. There's certain ways you can do that in GitHub with issue tracking. But the ones I wanted to talk about are these issues that GitHub is looking at specifically that are default issue tags that you can say good first issue or help wanted. And these are good ways of encouraging contribution because GitHub is looking for those and will help promote your site if you've got these things in there. But also contributors coming to it, they might want a small bite-sized piece of thing that they can contribute to code to you or contribute documentation to in your project, and using these issue labels is a good way of helping nurture that. Thinking about contributions, the kind of last point I wanted to make before I pass it on and we talk about some things that are not just GitHub and not just code, but also more broadly community related, are the idea of contributions to code. GitHub, when you're working on a project and you're hosting it in GitHub, GitHub is aware of every contribution and who it's been made to that code base and who it's been made by, and it's tracking that. So if I make some commits, here's a screenshot of one of our projects, the Choir project actually. So every time I make a commit or a change, it shows up here as a sort of added into that, and they can graph that participation. The thing that I think GitHub doesn't do really well is acknowledge other kinds of contributions. So as you're going to hear in the later part of the talks here. Software, building open source software is not just about writing code. It's also about documenting that code and getting funding for that project and writing tutorials and training and doing workshops and designing the logos, and everything involved in that is a big community of people. And GitHub really only tracks people who put code contributions in, who actually write code into the thing, into a project like that. So aside from GitHub, I wanted to kind of give a shout out to this project called allcontributors.org, which is it's a website. It's a little bot you can plug into your repository on GitHub, but it really tries to capture different kinds of, gives you a way of capturing different kinds of contributions to code. So, and this is the different types of contributions and I just said a few of them, that it will help you track. So answering questions, someone who answers questions on your forum, someone who blog posts about your thing, someone who just gives you ideas or help builds infrastructure, who does a talk or tutorial or writes tests or designs, writes content or documentation of any kind. All of that is sort of involved in building code and writing open source code and getting people to use it. And allcontributors.org is a great way of trying to start to capture that. All right, that was a lot, and I'm going to pass it on now. So these are my last points. Just add community health files is, I think, a positive thing to do. Write and label bite-sized issues to encourage people to start contributing to your software, and then credit them when they do. And thank you very much, and I'll pass it on.
To me or to?
To you.
Okay.
Yes.
To me. Okay. I think this is on, yep. Okay, hi. I'm Megan Forbes, and I'm the co-director for the It Takes a Village open source sustainability project, and also the program manager for the open source collections management system, Collection Space, both of which are housed at Lyrasis. So just talking about It Takes a Village today, and I will say I didn't name the project. That name came and then I came on the project, so sorry. So the first thing I want to say, we see the word sustainability a lot in a lot of different contexts with a lot of different meanings. So today when I use it, I'm using it like in a really specific context, like the It Takes a Village sustainability framework context. That context is sustainable software is that which is viable and effective for as long as it's needed. So there are many other definitions of sustainability, but this is the one that I am talking about today. I'll follow that up by saying that sustainability does not equal perpetuity. So viable and effective for as long as it's needed. So it doesn't mean that everything lives forever. It means it lives as long as we want it to and we need it to. So just talking a little bit about sort of how It Takes a Village came to be. So there is a large and growing body of open source applications that support cultural and scientific heritage organizations in collecting, organizing, preserving, disseminating our content, our information, right? You might be using Omeka or Drupal or any of these million projects that are out there. So some programs have been really successful at creating robust products with widespread adoption, engaged communities, again, looking at something like Omeka, while others have really struggled to determine what's gonna work once that grant funding or institutional support runs out. So when this project was proposed to the IMLS in 2017, there was really no standard method for folks to evaluate or think about or plan or have discussions about OSS sustainability. So we wrote this grant to the IMLS, and we had a couple of intended outcomes. So we wanted to just survey the programs, some of the major programs that are out there. Because this came out of Lyrasis has primarily, at the moment, an academic library audience that we're sort of biased in that direction in terms of the programs that we surveyed. But we just wanted that kind of baseline of information about program size, financial health, technology stack, technology roadmap, governance. We held an in-person forum where we brought together stakeholders from all these different applications so that we could talk about sustainability. What does it even look like? How do we talk about it? And then we wanted to create a guidebook that would help people move along the sustainability path. So from an unsustainable, hopefully, to a sustainable application. We also wanted to increase awareness around sustainability. It's like increase awareness. But it's really often, we see it in grant applications. It's an unfunded mandate in a lot of grant applications. What's the sustainability plan for this thing? And people didn't have a great way to answer that question. So we wanted to help with that. And then just create a space for people could meet each other and talk to each other and find out, hey, there are people that have the same problems that I do, and I thought I was alone in this, and it turns out I'm not. And so that was a really great outcome of our in-person meeting. So project leadership was comprised of lyricist staff, advisors from academic institutions and other nonprofits. And so we had a pretty diverse mix of programs who responded to our survey, joined us at the forum. So 27 programs total. So some people might be familiar with like Specify, which does specimen management for museums. LOX, which does digital preservation, Omeka. So that gang all came. And we had about 50 people come, again, to talk at this meeting. So the results of both the survey and the forum were really, really clear. So the first was that sustainable programs tend to grow from projects that were direct responses to community needs rather than programs that started with somebody had a really cool idea and then later thought that maybe they would find somebody who was interested in it. Also, sustainability is not a thing. You can't say, yes, now my program is sustainable, or if I solve this one problem, then we will magically be sustainable. It's not one thing, it's not a straight line. It has facets, they move in phases, they move together, they move separately. There's a lot going on. So we published this guidebook last year that sort of walks through all of it in great detail, but we're just gonna really kind of talk about the highlights today. So 3 general phases of development. So getting started, this is programs that are in the early stages, planning, design, development. The work is often grant funded or has sort of one strong institutional supporter, and the work is sort of exactly what you said you would do in the grant. You know, you're not thinking outside the box at that time. Staff are usually pulled from initial stakeholders. So I'll say choir's moving now into growing, right? They're hiring staff, they've got public releases. Growing is really big, right? This is where a project can take off and become sustainable or stall out and go away if they can't really take root. So this is sort of when we're really trying to transition from that grant or institutionally funded project into a sustainable program. And then stable but not static. These are programs that are mature, they're established, but it's really easy to feel like at that point you can coast. And so we have this stable, not static, because you need to be really vigilant to ensure that complacency doesn't set in. So things are going well, but you want to make sure they continue to go well. And then there are 4 facets. So there's phases and there's facets, all wheels within wheels. So governance is about establishing a model in which roles are defined for project participants, supports that process for strategic and tactical decision making, right? I mean, like very shortly, how do decisions get made? That's sort of your governance. Technology. So, you know, as Greg said, technology is but one slice of it. You know, we're talking about open source software. There are parallels with proprietary software development, but added challenges because of all these other facets, right? You have community, you have governance, you have resource constraints that you might not find outside the open source world. Resources, OSS projects need human and financial resources in order to grow and thrive. And so on the human side, right, that's everything from code writing, community members, colleagues, organizational homes, and then all the money going in and out on the financial side. And then the last facet is community engagement. So this reflects both efforts to foster involvement within a community. So we want our users working together and talking to one another, really participating in and championing the work. And it also includes communicating to the world outside about the project. So, you know, who are the decision makers out in the world? Who are the funders? Who we want to be telling about, telling our projects about. So then within the guidebook, what we tried to do is create a resource that would help projects move forward along this path to sustainability for each facet. So within the book, you know, you flip to the part about governance, you feel like that's the part you're not doing so well at, so you flip to governance, and you might see characteristics. So where am I? Am I in phase 1? Am I in phase 2? If you're phase 1 in tech, maybe you've never had a public release. You're phase 2 in resources, maybe you're hiring some dedicated program staff, you know, you're not 100% grant funded anymore. Then we talk about concerns, right? So all of those things that are sort of nagging you and you feel like maybe they're keeping you from moving along. So like governance, it adds so much overhead, or why is our community so needy? So all these various issues that you might have. And then moving forward is basically how to sort of overcome those things. So finding the right balance of governance, or expanding your income streams, or, you know, figuring out the best way to engage with your users so that you continue to move along that path. The next steps for It Takes a Village. So we have applied for funding for a second round from the IMLS. So the irony, of course, is that It Takes a Village itself is not financially sustainable. So we've applied for some grant funding for round 2. And that we're looking for, so we have the guidebook, and the guidebook is nice, and it gives you a framework in which to sort of think about it and talk about it, which people didn't really have before. But now we get a lot of feedback saying, like, okay, but what do I do? Like, how do I do it? And so we're trying to develop really concrete exercises that you can, like, literally print out and go through with your team, with your community, to sort of help get you into that sustainability mindset. So it's not something that would necessarily take the place of something like strategic planning, but we sort of think about it as like a layer. So when you're thinking about strategic planning and when you're making those decisions, like we want It Takes a Village to be the little angel on your shoulder who's like, what about sustainability? And so you just sort of think about those things as you're planning along. And so an example of one of our exercises, and just because it's a fun one, so for governance, again, how decisions get made, one of our favorite activities is called catastrophizing, where everybody on the project takes a big whiteboard and you write down like all the truly awful things that could happen. And, or really, they don't have to be a catastrophe. So here we, say choir. Greg wins the lottery and he moves to you move to an island and they don't have the internet there, right.
So long, Getty.
Right, so long, Getty. I don't need you anyhow. So, right, we try to say, like, right, I know the traditional is to get hit by a bus, but wouldn't it be nicer if you moved to an island? Wouldn't it be nicer if you moved to an island? Right. You're not hitting me with the bus, right.
Yeah, that's good.
So this is a really good governance exercise, though. So here we have the choir project. You've moved to your island where they don't have the internet. So, like, how would that work? Like, can choir keep going? Do people know who to ask if Greg is gone? I don't know if you're actually the program manager for the project, I'm just assuming. Figuring out what's that right amount so that we can sort of weather some of these catastrophes, we can move on from them. And so it helps to get some of those examples out there. And it's also something, we try to make it strategic planning and writing your mission and writing your vision can often be sort of painful. And so with It Takes a Village, we try to make it more on the fun side of life. We all are doing this because we want to be doing this. And so that's where we are right now. So we're in that sort of funding, IMLS, please give us some money. So if anybody's grant reading for the spring, just keep that in mind. And that's it. So that's It Takes a Village. You can, of course, download the guidebook. That's, freely available. Lyrasis.org/It Takes a Village. You shoot me an email. Obviously, I'll talk about it all day. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have if you have a project that, needs a little help launching. We're there for you.
Thank you. And I'll say, too, we'll put it back up, but we have all the links in the slides as well at the end. There's a bunch of links that you can get to, and they'll be, you can just, maybe, yeah. So the links are in the slides, and we'll share with you when we get to the end again the bit.ly that will get you to the slides as well, so you have all that information with you if you need it. All right.
Fantastic. So you've heard a little bit now about some tools that you might want to use in your open source journey and some kind of models for thinking about where your projects might be and where you might take them to a more sustainable place. I am going to share a few lessons learned from, I guess to use the terminology we just learned, a stable but not static project called Open Data Kit, and some possible resources for you to take things to the next level through the Mozilla Open Leaders project. So my name is Ellen Martin. I'm a committer on the Open Data Kit project. I work for an organization, well, I am part owner of an organization called Nafundi. And I am not directly museum affiliated. So Open Data Kit is a series of tools that replace paper forms with mobile devices. So again, I'm not directly museum affiliated, but I know these tools are used in various museum contexts to do things like catalog remote artifacts and to engage with users within a museum context. So I actually was looking at the program and seeing that in the next hour, there are a couple of sessions about getting live feedback from users and engaging in a dynamic way with users. Some museums use these tools to build custom forms that will allow their I don't know if you call them users, but their visitors, I guess, to engage with whatever exhibits you have in a different way. So we have tools to build forms, to collect data, and to aggregate results. So to give a little bit of context on this project and why I call it stable but not static. So it's been around for about 11 years now. 2008 was when it was founded. This was a university project, so not, again, quite the same as your museum context, but pretty similar, right? I guess some of you are probably from academic libraries where it's very, very similar. Grant funding, lots of access to students who are considered free labor, right? Of course they're not, so they get paid somehow. But that's kind of the way this project was jump-started. Between that start and 2016, it was maintained by UW staff and students, and kind of organically, as some of the other panelists have said, when there's a need, things happen. There's a big ecosystem that emerged around these tools. So there are now tools that are compatible to do analysis in different contexts, to do data collection on computers rather than mobile devices. And these are all maintained by people that I have never met. And in 2012 is when Nifundi, the company that I'm now co-owner of, was started. I wasn't involved at that time, but it was started as a services company. So it was offering consulting services on top of this set of tools. In 2017, the project, the research group at UW moved on, and so the project had to sort of find a new home. And that's when I joined Nifundi, and we decided to say, we can be that new home. We'll be kind of making sure that things move forward in the project, that somebody is at the GitHub repository triaging issues, that someone is thinking about sustainability, and making sure that there are folks to carry on the work. So that's why I say maintained by community. That's always the dream that, there'll be this great big community of a bunch of people who show up and do the work, but in reality, it's our small consulting company that kind of keeps it going. So we do a mix of services and grants to keep it going. We consider that a form of sustainability, although of course it's a grind. We always have to make sure that we have funding to keep ourselves going. In 2018, we took a big step towards being more community-oriented by having a technical steering committee. So this is the governance that we heard about, is how do we make decisions? We formalized that by having folks from a diverse set of organizations sit on a board and help steer the software on a day-to-day basis. I also participated in the Mozilla Open Leaders program, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about. So Mozilla Open Leaders is a program open to any kind of project that wants to work openly. It's 14 weeks of training and mentorship on broadly open practice. So it's helping answer the question of how do we make decisions and create artifacts publicly. That could be software, but it could also be guidebooks or various kinds of, again, collaborative projects. It's cohort-based, so you have a group of people working on very different projects or getting together and talking about these issues. You get mentorship from someone who's previously participated in the program, so someone who is working on an open project and can share their experience. And then you get practical experience, the kinds of exercises that Megan was talking about, actually doing it and having a little bit of social pressure to get it done, right? Because it's one thing to say, we're going to do a catastrophizing exercise one day. And it's another to have a mentor who's going to say, hey, so you said last week that you and your project members were going to do this exercise. Did you do it? So to me, that was the real value of this program, is just someone is watching over your shoulder and actually make sure that you're not pushing governance and sustainability and all these things that make an open source project thrive to the next week and the next week and the next week. It's very easy to do when you're really focused on your artifact, right? Your museum probably has a need yesterday that you need to fulfill. Why do all this community building? The positive effects are probably further out in the future. So Mozilla kind of describes the program in this way. They say that open leaders design and build projects that empower others to collaborate within inclusive communities. So the idea is to take all these awesome tools that your organizations are already building and adding as part of the process, bringing others in and making the community a little bit broader so others can benefit from your own understanding of your communities and the tools that you're building. There are links throughout, and as Greg said, there will be an easy to jot down link that gets you to all of this. So the framework that Mozilla uses is the idea that any community project and organization can be open with these 3 characteristics. Understanding, so making sure that the work is accessible and clear, making sure that your GitHub page has a README where someone can actually know what is being built here, right? There are wonderful projects that just say, builds widgets, and you're like, okay, well, and you never know what it is. It promotes sharing, so that means that the work is easy to adapt, to reproduce, and to spread. So again, you might have a beautiful description of what your project is, but if nobody can actually run it, then they can't make use of it. So emphasizing sharing from the start can ensure that, that work is available to a broader group of people. And then again, emphasizing participation and inclusion. That means sharing ownership. So even though you're focused on your museum, your organization, there might be others around the world who would like to participate and could bring really great value to whatever you're building if they also had a little bit of recognition, maybe in contributors, and a little bit of ownership of what is being produced. So these 2 dimensions I talked about, and Mozilla puts in this kind of grid of, as we're developing an open community, we can design, build, and empower for understanding, sharing, participation, and inclusion. So I think this fits in really nicely with what Megan shared. We can see she was talking about governance. We can think about that as designing for participation and inclusion. If we have a clear decision-making process that's in the open, then we're more likely to get other organizations to participate. So I encourage you to take a moment if you're interested in Mozilla Open Leaders at looking at their framework. I think it gives you a nice sense of how you can evaluate your own project for how it is doing in an open, how open it is, and then make progress towards being more open. I mentioned there are a lot of hands-on exercises that we do throughout the 14-week long mentorship session. And one of the tools that gets used is this open canvas. It's adapted from the lean canvas, so it comes kind of from a startup mentality. But it's a very simple but powerful tool for organizing one's thinking when you're trying to make progress towards a more inclusive project or a more open project. Looking at what problems do we have. There aren't any contributors, it's just me at my desk doing stuff, You can kind of go through this process to get insights on how you might solve it. And the real value, I think, of doing the Open Leaders program is someone's looking over your shoulder saying, did you do your open canvas for this problem that you identified? And are you going to actually put some of these great ideas that have emerged into practice? So as I went through this program with, again, our pretty mature open source project, I found a few targeted projects that I could work on. One of them was providing greater visibility into roadmap. I think this is a really common problem that open projects have, is that there's a lot of context that people have in their heads, that the programmers have in their heads about where they're going and what they think the next feature is going to be. And it makes it very hard for others to engage, even as users, if they don't know where things are going. So I had definitely identified that was a problem for Open Data Kit for our project. And what I ended up doing with the Open Leaders program was building a process for road mapping and making sure that was always available and up to date. So we used a GitHub board for that. And it's simple Kanban board kind of things, but we've committed to keeping it up to date and to making sure that the technical steering committee reviews it on a bi-weekly basis. And that way, users have a lot more visibility into what's being built. Another thing that has really worked very well for our community, and that I also did some work on during the Open Leaders program, was using our discourse forum to provide, again, more visibility and more sharing with our community of users. So if you're not familiar with Discourse, it's a bulletin board, kind of message board piece of software. It's open source, free, etc. It's actually, it offers free hosting for open source projects, so it might be something you're interested in. And to me, it's really the missing part in GitHub. So GitHub is great for, I found this bug, Greg, can you fix it for me? Or, I'm gonna fix it myself, but it doesn't provide the greater context. It can through things like road mapping, but it doesn't provide the, hey, Greg, do you think that we should be going in the direction of publishing our books on watches? That doesn't fit well in a GitHub issue, but it fits really well in this kind of free-form discussions. Same thing with support. User support doesn't fit so well in GitHub. People file issues, but it gets lost in the shuffle. Discourse is really, really great for that. So one of the things I did with Open Leaders was, again, getting some process for where things should go, what categories we should have, and making sure we had a really vibrant conversation going on about the tools, and so that everybody could kind of stay up to date on what's happening. So, I think of museums, I'm a user of museums, I'm a lover of museums, I'm not a contributor to museums yet, maybe I will be, but from my perspective, I think of museums as great public goods in our community. And open source can also be great public goods, right? And a software that anyone can pick up and change has the power to be tremendously valuable. So I think it's a really natural combination. I'm a little bit sad to see Greg's analysis that it looks like people are just throwing things out there passively and not finding ways to collaborate. So hopefully some of the tools that we've shared today will give some ideas to move in that direction.
Thank you. Great. There's the links. I mean, let's put up that. All right, so I think plenty of time, right? Yeah. Let me move to that slide that has that link so you guys can grab this, all of them if you'd like them. And does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have any questions? I'll just leave it there. Otherwise, I'm going to ask you all questions. No? Hold on one sec. There it is. All right, so the link is as a bit.ly link, bit.ly/more-of-open. More of open. So that'll give you the slides, and the slides have all the links. I'm curious, just in the room, if I could ask you all, in the room, is anyone, who here is sort of putting things up on GitHub yourselves? Like, who's doing that work? Who's putting, one hand, 2.5? I'll give you that 3.
Be proud.
Okay, so it's not that many. All right. So that's, okay, good. So what, maybe, I don't know, now I want to ask you all kinds of things now that I know that. Let me start here, actually, Megan, I had a question for you. You said sustainable programs grow from community needs. Do you have any, and one of the things that one of the things that we see, or that I feel like seeing on GitHub and museums' use of GitHub and throwing the projects up there in repositories is that we're first responding to our own needs internally, right? We have projects, we have things, code that needs to be read, we have functions that need to be done. So we do that and we put it up there. Can we reverse engineer? Do you have any sense of other tips for, and this, Ellen, you can answer this as well, for going back and saying, okay, we've done all this work, we did it anyway, we're happy to share it. Can we go identify if any of these actually meet a community need, in which case then we can maybe put some more energy to it? Like, how would you go about reverse engineering rather than starting from the community need, but rather trying to match a community need with an existing something?
I think this community should have a discourse forum.
Well, no, I mean, that was my answer. Like, here everybody is. And so I think, thinking, I know that MCN made changes this year, and so that's something to think about sort of moving forward is like, here's the OSS, Scrum room, and people are going to come with some of the tools that they have, and they're going to talk to people about whether they're useful and what might make them more broadly applicable. How do I turn this from something that's useful only at the Getty to something that's useful everywhere? Because that's really what it's about. It's about going out and talking to people and finding out what the needs are, and then, seeing if your tool can support those. And so, conferences are such a nice place because here we are. You can actually talk to people face to face, in groups of them even.
Right.
So, yeah.
I think it's also really valuable just to bake that into the start of a project. So I think with Open Data Kit, one of the things that has made it an ongoing concern is unusual for a research project to last 10 years or to last more than a few months, really. And I think one of the things that makes it different is that it was developed with field partners. So in this case, it was the Jane Goodall Institute, I think World Health Organization, but a few folks who had very clear data collection needs in the field. And so they became the champions. And so I think as one of your organizations is thinking about building custom software, you can right away say, well, hey, you know, I know folks at this museum and that museum and that museum, and why don't I just contact them and see if they're also interested. I think, you know, it sounds obvious, but it can be hard with funding to make that work, but it can really pay off.
That's one thing we talked about a little bit, the funding model too. Maybe we can chat about that a little bit. Is what are the models out there? So Ellen, you're using a services and grants combination of things. Is that common, and are you seeing that a lot? And are there other options that people could be thinking about in terms of sustaining their, or sort of finding funding for a project that maybe started as an internal museum project and expanding it out into the world? What should people be looking at? Either of you.
Sure. So yeah, services, super common. The other probably biggest model that we see is membership, either membership or sponsorship. So bigger in academia where you kick in, you know, so I want Fedora, or, you know, big institutional repository. I want Fedora to last, so I'm Stanford, so I'm going to give them $20,000 a year. I get a seat at governance, you know, and I'm ensuring that that software is going to live a long time. So I would say, yeah, services, grants. I mean, almost nobody is completely grant-free, so people can often get to sustainability for like operating expenses, but if you want to do something else, so this bit of the software is end of lifing, we need to replace it, that's almost always grants. And yeah, services is very popular.
And I used to feel uncomfortable about grants because it doesn't feel sustainable. But then I realized that, you know, at least in our sector in global development, and I think it's true in the museum space, if you're doing services, a lot of the services are grant funded probably as well. So might as well just go to the source.
They have the middleman.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
What else? Yeah.
I just wanted to, I've really enjoyed this talk, by the way. Wanted to plus one the community discourse, because so all of our code repositories in Bitbucket.
Okay.
So not GitHub,
Yeah.
but yeah, they're solving all of the problems we have at our institution, Robert Kumar, Big Brain. But it takes effort to change something from like a custom piece of software that's solving one problem to something that would be more broadly useful.
Yeah.
Extract out secrets and like those big elements that you would want these in public repo. So like if there was a place to go to know, oh hey, like other people might be interested in this piece of software, that'd be great.
Awesome. Plus one noted. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, in the back.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about not just the financial sustainability, but the technical part of it. Like, how in the planning stage, you're not in a situation where you have a primary computer and then 2 years later the turnover, that person is gone, nobody else maintains the project. Like, how do you prevent that early on in the planning?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's something I'm looking back to. David Newberry sitting in the back. He's oversees a lot of software work, or all the software work at the Getty in many ways, and that's something that he's dealing with directly. David, do you want to talk about that even? Do you want to answer that a little bit, or do you want me to paraphrase what you do?
Keep that in mind.
Okay, all right. I'll take it. Now I can make up my own answer. No, so one of the big things is we had that a lot. That was an issue across the Getty in a lot of different ways because digital was spread out throughout the institution, and people were singular people were building things, solutions, and then they would move on, and they were the ones that built and knew that solution the most. So one thing we're doing is making sure that developers are actually not being assigned or not being relegated to a single thing, but are getting experience on the whole platform and a whole suite of areas. So like in my case for Choir, we don't have necessarily one developer who's dedicated to Choir. We actually have 5 developers, or not really, but 5. Yeah, I want 5 developers, David. We have several developers who are all working a small portion of it. And so that helped, that's sort of from the beginning, spreading around the work and not just relying on that one person. Even if the one person came up with the vision, if they started it, bringing other people in to work on it as early as possible is one way to do it for sure. Yeah. Do you
Right, and then I would say, again, sort of thinking about sustainability, like from day one, as opposed to when you start the panic phase, like, so doing it pre-panic, so that you think about it, so that you say, okay, well, we've made these technology decisions, and we've made these technology decisions because this is the problem that we're trying to solve, and so, you know, this JavaScript framework is the correct solution, you know. But then thinking about, okay, so so collection space anecdote, we had a funder. The funder strongly recommended that we partner with somebody who had a framework that was not sustainable. It didn't have contributors, it didn't have documentation, and so we sort of got locked into it. And that turned out to be really unsustainable for us, because then we couldn't have contributors and we couldn't have people sort of sharing with the software. So luckily we could go back to the funder and say, like, you got us into this mess. Can we have some money to get out of it now? But thinking about those decisions really early on, like, are the technology decisions that you're making, is the software sort of decoupled from itself enough that you can swap pieces in and out as things sunset? Again, instead of 5 years down the line being like, great, Microsoft has discontinued support for Fox Pro, and that's what underpins our entire application, So not having it be something that you do after, but that is really baked into project planning from day one.
A couple things I would add to that, these are all great answers, is building a culture of code review. So I don't know if that's something all of you are familiar with, but the idea that before anything actually gets merged, becomes part of the source of truth for a piece of software, someone else has to look at it. And so that forces you to have at least 2 people who've looked at everything. And that's something we've instituted in the last 3 years on Open Data Kit, and it's really paid off, because there's always another person who knows what's going on. And then this is harder, I don't know how to do this exactly, but I think there needs to be a bit of a cultural shift between for developers to value maintaining existing software a little bit more. And so maybe that's something that if you're a project manager, it's something that you can reward and congratulate folks for doing that more than starting something new. I think it's always very sexy to start something new, right? And it's easier in a way, because you only have to deal with your own brain. And I think really rewarding and recognizing the work that maintenance and understanding what somebody else did, even if it's not exactly the way you do it, I think is a really important part of shifting towards collaboration rather than, hey, I'm going to get to build a whole new thing in my corner.
Yeah. David, yeah.
So some of the early open source work that I've done, the developer community and user community are the same people. They tend to be tools for developers. A lot of the work that I've been doing more recently, there are 2 communities, a user community and developer community. And we've seen it's much harder to work with these 2 communities who have different needs and different things. Can you give us any advice or insight into ways that people deal with that problem?
Have a discourse forum.
Is that your answer? That's
I'm
your answer to everything.
No, I mean,
Amazing.
I'm very serious, actually. Because it's much more approachable for a user, and you can have templates that have user language rather than things being about issues and pull requests and tickets. Like, what are these things? I just want to use my cool museum software or whatever it is. Where we have that split. So our users are mostly non-technical, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. They have power intermittently. They do not want to deal with the code. And so I think having a place that is welcoming, that's jargon-free, where people can come and talk about their workflows and their needs on a non-technical level is really, really important. But it's somewhat uncharted territory. So that's why we look at Mozilla, for example. A lot of users are non-technical, or there's like QGIS. The GIS community has kind of similar universes, and so we look at those for ideas, and their user forums are really important.
If your developers are able to sit with people who are doing the work and truly understand what they're doing, sort of sit there and watch them use the tools and try to accomplish the things that they're trying to accomplish. We have similar tensions, like we have collections managers and registrars on one side and, software engineers on the other. And so honestly, having them sit down and look over the shoulder of people who are doing the work to understand like some of the daily grind stuff, I think helps the engineers be a little more empathetic on the one hand, and then also being very open. So, something like Discourse or that for the end users to understand, because somebody earlier brought up, what do people want? Search, they want Google. People also sort of don't understand, like, some of these projects might have 1 or 2 developers versus thousands. Well, Google can turn this stuff around in a day. Well, sure, they have thousands and thousands of people working there. We have 2. And so understanding the work that they do, and so being really open and sharing so much of that out to say, we made these architecture changes because it's going to have this benefit for you. The software is going to be more sustainable or whatever, so that it doesn't feel like this super opaque, oh, they updated the JDK. I don't know what that means. Sort of here's how it affects you, and here's why it's good, and you should support it. And we want to make sure we let everybody go
Yep.
to get to the 2 o'clock thing, too.
Yeah, you have a question?
Quick question.
Yeah.
So, Greg, you have this mapping open source museums project, and I see on here that you're thinking about expanding it to external vendors and firms, which I think makes a lot of sense, especially in the context of the conversations that we've been having earlier this morning about how museums are this kind of field that set themselves apart from other fields that are doing very similar things. What is your plan for this? Do you have, now that you've sort of gathered a certain amount of data, do you have further questions that you're looking to ask with this sort of data set? And how is this sort of interfacing with your work in Flyer?
Good one. So in brief, certainly like it's that mapping the open source has been sort of a side project around this around MCN. So I would like to see it expand. I would like it to be seen as a resource in some way. I think that it would involve being a little bit more collaborative and bringing actually in a community to help like open sourcing that project certainly, and maybe plugging in a discourse and like finding ways that we can involve other people. I think is the sort of key thing. The big sort of thing that I didn't get out of that data is that you miss like what's actually going on, like are people using it in other ways? GitHub can only tell you so much. So I really ran into a point where we can know a few things, we can put some numbers to some things, but we can't really dig into like the whys and the hows. So that it's more survey and more people work, certainly. Okay, do you have one, did you have a question as well? Okay, great. Thank you all very much, appreciate you coming, and yes.